We're beginning Chapter 20, Khrushchev's Challenge, the U-2 Dilemma. As the glow of sunrise illuminated the snow-capped peaks of the western Himalayas, the pilot moved the throttle lever to full power, and the heavily laden plane began a lazy roll down the long runway at Peshawar. The engine whined. The rate of acceleration was slow, and with each unevenness of the runway, the long downward sloping wings flopped up and down, unable to come to life at the slow speed. And then, with more speed, the wings began to fly. They rose and steadied. The flopping and oscillation dampened out, and they strained to lift the heavy plane into the air. Just before the runway ran out, one last light bump, gentle as the tiptoe leap of the ballet dancer, lifted the plane into the air. And it was instantly transformed into a thing of beauty, a graceful, long-winged jet. As speed built up and the wheels were retracted, the plane sped through the pre-dawn haze. The pilot eased the flaps up into the wings and began to climb toward the mountains. High above and to the left was the historic Khyber Pass. On course, there was a pink-tinged 25,000-foot peak, and further to the right was Godwin Austen, over 28,000 feet, wearing its perennial white plume. The jet was so heavy that the pilot swung it into a lazy turn inside the valley to a spiral up and out, gaining altitude as he went, until he was above that famous path of the conquerors through the Khyber and nearly level with the 25,000-foot mountaintop. Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, lay below. To the right, Tazik, the first major city inside the Soviet Union, lay ahead with Tashkent beyond. Border crossing was made at Kadirovabad in a climb to 60,000 feet. The sky was clear and dark blue, the sky that only the small band of jet pilots know the world around. At this altitude, the weather, whatever weather there was a remote thing, noticed only as patches of white cloud below, obscuring the ground. At cruising altitude, the cockpit air system had cleared out all moisture, and the canopy was clear and brittle. Visibility was almost limitless. The pilot was a lone soul above the world, above all normal environment, under a simple, burning sun, and turned to the even silence of the engine and the slow, mushy responsiveness of the controls in the near vacuum of the atmosphere at that height. In the still early morning at Peshawar, the operational team had just finished flashing their message to Washington. Puppy 68 was off and on his way to Norway via Sverdlovsk. That's as good as you're getting out of me. The watch officer in the special U-2 control office in downtown Washington got that word shortly after 8:30 p.m. on the evening of April 30th. Dick Bissell, the agency man in charge of the U-2 project, was notified immediately. Then, in short succession, 4 other men were called. One by one, they heard the same information. Puppy 68 is away. President Eisenhower was at his favorite retreat, Camp David, with Prime Minister Macmillan of Great Britain putting the finishing touches on plans for the summit conference. De Gaulle had just left Washington, and Macmillan and de Gaulle were scheduled to meet again in Paris on May 5th. All was well in the world. The aging men who had led the Cold War through World War II and then through the bitterness of the Cold War were preparing to culminate their long efforts in a great summit conference and then, one by one, lay down the mantle of government to a new generation who would reap the benefits of peace, hopefully true and lasting peace. The fate of the world hung in the balance somewhere between these earnest plans for peace and the miles remaining ahead of that U-2 as it neared Sverdlovsk. This was not the normal U-2 flight. Much was made of the fact that the pilot had with him a vile needle of poison, so that rather than expose his native land to charges of willful violation of the airspace and sovereignty of the Soviet Union, he could silence himself in death. The code of the spy. Yet little was made of this antithetical fact that the pilot also had a parachute which would save his life. Much was made of the fact afterwards that this was a civilian aircraft and that it was flown by a civilian pilot. Yet this pilot had been permitted to carry with him to this flight his military identification card, complete with name and picture, along with a pocket full of other identifying cards, all of which easily placed him at military installations, in military instrument flight schools, and on military facilities just days before the flight. He was hardly a deniable spy. Much was made later of the fact that Air Force Captain Powers had resigned from the Air Force, and that he was a civilian employee of the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. He was technically a civilian, but his records were still held by the Air Force, and had he chosen, he could have returned to the Air Force without loss of pay, seniority, and promotion status. Furthermore, the number of identification items that he had with him made it clear that he was less a true civilian and more a civilian cover spy pilot. He was in the same mold as Alan Pope in 1958, who was captured by the Indonesians, and of the Air Force crew that was shot down in Armenia also in 1958. By that time, the Russians had plenty of evidence to know that civilian pilots belonged to the CIA by way of the U.S. Air Force. This course of events had more impact upon the United States than upon the Soviet Union. The U.S. government made much of the fact that the U-2 was an unarmed civilian aircraft and that it was flown by a civilian. However, in his book, The Craft of Intelligence, Alan Dulles makes much of the fact that operation of such sophisticated aircraft could scarcely have been kept a secret. It wasn't. As he wrote, sooner or later, certainly this would have leaked out. Since this was so certain, then why did the U.S. government have to give out untrue cover stories? And why did they have to permit Powers to carry so much identification when it would have been better to limit the leak as much as possible? Even if he had died, they would have had all the information they needed. How did it happen that they broke with policy procedures for that special flight by letting him take off loaded with incriminating evidence that proved he was a U.S. spy pilot? Who was it who wanted this special U-2 flight on May 1st, Valpurgis night, 1960, 2 weeks before the summit conference, to fail and then to become so glaring an admission of guilt when it did fail that it would inevitably doom the summit conference along with it? The incident of these things, too many things, give weight to the thought that this flight was intended to be something rather special. Nothing was said that all clandestine operations personnel, and especially the selected coterie of U-2 pilots, were required to Nothing was said that all clandestine operations personnel, and especially the selected coterie of U-2 pilots, were required to submit to a complete inspection before takeoff, which included the removal of all clothes and other personal effects, and the issue of sanitized, non-identifiable clothing and equipment sufficient only for the flight. Neither pilot nor plane were sanitized on this flight, as was required on other flights. But these are only details that came up after the flight. The special question about this flight and this plane and this pilot was, who sent him out in the first place? What was this flight supposed to gain that could have been worth one particle of what it lost? The Secretary of State, in attempting to justify the flight, and as the official spokesman for his government said, conditions at a latter season would have prevented obtaining very important information. There is never a good time for a failure of an intelligence mission. We believe it unwise to lower our vigilance because of these political negotiations. Then, the following 3 reasons for operating this flight were given. 1. Clear skies had been forecast, which meant clear pictures. 2. May 1st, for the Russians, is something like the 4th of July for Americans. Velperjusnacht. It is a national holiday that honors the solidarity of the working class. In Moscow, it is the occasion for a display of armed might in a mammoth parade that winds past the Kremlin, where high Soviet officials, including Khrushchev, watched the troops and material go by from a reviewing stand. It was felt in Washington that the Soviet vigilance might have relaxed on May 1st because of the holiday, that perhaps radar and anti-aircraft crews would be celebrating to the detriment of their defenses. 3. The CIA had intelligence that a new Soviet rocket, twice as large as anything produced by the USA, would be on its launching pad for a May Day test. The launching pad, it was known, was at a new missile base near Sverdlovsk industrial complex, and noted that the launch points were domed rather than following the herringbone pattern of the older Russian ground-to-air missile sites. For some reason, almost everything about this flight was different, and for some reason, it had to go at precisely the time when it would cause the most to alarm if it failed. A careful rereading of the objectives of this flight fails to confirm them to be of sufficient significance to override the natural precautions that should have been taken, especially since every top official in the government knew how important the summit conference was to the president, and only high-level officials or knowledgeable secret team members could have launched that flight. All of these regular launch authorities certainly knew that they were under the strictest orders to do nothing that would jeopardize the success of the conferences. Settle down, Cal.
How y'all doing?
Good. You settle down, Cal.
Up. There you go. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good day. You do the same, man. Beautiful one, huh?
Yeah. Have a nice day. Flights such as this one from Pakistan, Turkey, and Norway were tracked by U.S. radars and other sensitive tracking equipment. The plane did not have to maintain total silence after all. Anything the long-range radars from peripheral areas could track from hundreds of miles away, the Russian air defense system could track from 12, the flight altitude, to a few hundred miles. The Soviets would know the plane was there. As we learned later, they knew of almost every flight during the previous 4 years. They had tracked and forced down countless U.S. aircraft in preceding years. It had been known for decades that the Soviet radar is as good or better than ours. They tracked the U-2 planes but could not reach them at their extreme altitude, so the U-2 could communicate, not in the usual manner, but with flash or squirt-coded transmissions at predetermined times. In spite of the rather strange way in which the news of the loss was announced, there is no reason why we should believe that some authorities in this country did not know that it had occurred, and perhaps they knew exactly why it went down. Yet they ordered the administrator of NASA to give out an unreasonable cover story, which even said the plane had come from Turkey. When the plane went down, its signals faded and it was lost from tracking radar. The engine had stopped, and Powers was gliding the plane down from its extreme altitude, which was so high that the oxygen's air content was insufficient to support combustion. The normal combustion of the jet engine at that altitude had to be assisted by the infusion of a trace of raw hydrogen from a small liquid hydrogen cryogenic storage bottle. If by some chance the engine either coughed itself out, or if something happened to this slight hydrogen supply and the engine flamed out, it could not be restarted at that altitude. The pilot would have no recourse other than to let down and see if he could restart the engine at some lower altitude. The evidence that the engine would not restart even at 30,000 feet indicates that the trouble was most likely hydrogen deficiency and not a normal fuel flameout. Had it been a simple flameout, and had there been plenty of hydrogen, the engine should have restarted, as others had in similar circumstances. When the plane did not restart, Powers was forced to let it continue to spiral toward the Earth, and then at a safer altitude either bail out. A high-altitude bailout is dangerous and violent, or continue on down to the ground. Actually, some of the early pictures of the U-2 showed an aircraft that was relatively undamaged. When one considers that the Russian story was that it was hit by a rocket in the air and then crashed into the ground, we may never really know where Powers parachuted because he was hit by Russian rockets or gunfire, or whether he parachuted simply to leave a plane that was doomed to crash anyhow. The elaborate pictures of the plane, which the Soviets released at the trial, show neither bullet damage nor rocket fragment damage, although at that point neither would be important. The plane was going to come down. If it had not been on the way down, neither rockets nor bullets would have been able to bring it down in those days. Those who had been watching the progress of the flight from Washington Control soon learned that the U-2 had dropped from surveillance, and they may have received coded information that gave them solid clues as to why the plane did come down. After all, space technology had reached the point by that time that ground tracking stations could tell every minute change and environmental perturbation on a remote nose cone. There was no reason why anyone should expect that the U-2 tracking system was not at least as good as that. Nose cones transit the Soviet Union all the time and are monitored all of that time. The U-2 was most likely monitored in the same manner. Therefore, it was not long before the alerted officials in Washington knew that Gary Powers was down somewhere in Russia. In spite of this firm knowledge, they instructed the CIA to say nothing. By this time, the president had returned to his Gettysburg farm, and Secretary of State Herter was in Turkey, continuing his rounds of talks prior to the summit conference. As far as Eisenhower and Herter were concerned, all was well, and the conference was a short 2 weeks away. In the belief and the hope that the crash had been unobserved and undiscovered by the Russians, Allen Dulles suggested that the administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, T. Keith Glennon, release a pre-prepared cover story. Glennon reported that a high-altitude weather research aircraft on a flight from Adana, Turkey, was missing, and that it might have accidentally violated Soviet airspace. At that time, he added that these aircraft were special U-2 high-altitude planes and that they were essential to the space program. It was believed that this frankness would take some of the heat off of the flight, especially if the Russians should ever find the wreckage and report it. This was the initiative Khrushchev had been waiting for. On the 5th of May, 5 long days after the plane had landed, he reported that an American plane had been shot down over Russian territory. He gave no more detail than that, although he did harangue about American warmongers, and those Americans who remembered recalled that the Russians had shot down that innocent U.S. Air Force transport aircraft in June 1958. They began to look as though the barbaric Russians were being trigger-happy again, and that they had shot down another innocent weather plane. Those who knew the real fate of the U-2 remained silent, and those who did not went through their paces like automatons. I gotta come back.